cinema, why would you recommend people to watch these films? Why do you like them?
Why do I like them?
How would you recommend them to people?
You're asking, would I recommend them, or why would I recommend Hindi Urdu cinema, in particular Hindi? Well, I think all cinema in some ways is a document of life, even when it's the most unrealistic, claptrap, bourgeois ideology. Often, it still nonetheless captures elements of life. So just for those reasons, it's important, I think, just because you see the incredible changes and transformation in Indian life over the past 100 years. It's a distinctive aesthetic form that probably didn't develop anywhere else in the world. In that sense, I think it's part of world cultural heritage. The sort of traditional masala film, just a very distinctive form of expression. So that in that sense, it has a value. But I have to say that the majority of those films are trash, and there are only very few films in the history of cinema that I would say consistently hold up to something like what I would call the beautiful, or the politically powerful, or the sort of aesthetically shocking and things like that. But that's true of any cinema, right? I mean, I wouldn't say you should go out and watch all of Hollywood, right? You don't say, oh yeah, go watch some Hollywood. You can say that with Bollywood, because not very few of the films that made in India as Hindi cinema actually make it outside the country. I mean, it produces something close between 900 to 1,200 films a year, something like 3 times the amount of Hollywood. But that's because around 90% of those films fail at the box office because they're such schlock, right? And very few have the sort of planning, production value, backing that a kind of cinema that can circulate globally does. So, but that's one thing about global circulation. I mean, the other thing about it is making good cinema. And I'd say there have been some fantastic examples of great cinema in the history of Hindi Urdu cinema. So I mean, I think those are all good reasons to engage with that history. But then you have to be discerning, right? There are certain films that will speak to certain, I think, people. Like, there's a reason why Raj Kapoor's films in the 1950s became the most popular films in Russia. Because there was a moment when, the idea of addressing poverty in the third world in a way that was critical of the various systems of oppression, that resonated with the people in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And also probably because their own cultural production had been so squashed by Stalinism, but that is another matter. But so that kind of resonance happens historically, when an aesthetic style or a particular narrative or story resonates with a people who are very different from that cultural expression. So, I mean, in all those things, I mean, there, all these ways to say is that there are moments of deep brilliance and genius in the cinema, and those, that they've been written about many, many times. Not many times, but they've been written about a lot. So, I mean, I could sort of mention what I think are great cinema if you want me to do that.
Yeah, go ahead.
What are my favorite films? I like all the films by Guru Dutt, almost all of them. Guru Dutt was a 1950s, early 60s filmmaker, and he made films that were never valued in his time because they were deeply tragic. They didn't end in marriages. They ended up, with a sense that life doesn't work out like stories would want them to work out. And that was really the first time a kind of disharmony was introduced into the narrative form of Hindi Urdu cinema. And Guru Dutt was just a brilliant director. So there was a sense that he was really an auteur. And this, films like Kagaj Ki Phool and Sai Bibi Ghulam, Pyasa, these are, for me, classic moments. And for me, that's also indicative of why that's a classic moment, because it's untimely. I think the greatest expressions of cinema are untimely to where they are. They both grasp something of the time, but do so in a way that anticipates a future. And that's what I think Guru Dutt was doing. I mean, other people who have done it, there's some films by Dev Anand that I just love. Anand is by Hrishikesh Mukherjee. Dev Anand, Guide, I just love the film, Guide. Hrishikesh Mukherjee is another filmmaker who, although not a popular filmmaker, nonetheless worked with the greatest sort of superstar, megastar actors. For instance, the movie Anand, which is an incredible film, stars Amitabh Bachchan and Rajesh Khanna. I mean, the more recent films that I like, LSD, Dev D, the Wasipur, the two Wasipur films, those are all Hatke cinema, and I guess for me, I'm just drawn to Hatke cinema for aesthetic reasons. Also, I kind of like the marketing. I kind of like what they're doing with the image of cinema, because they're being ironic about it. They're both taking it seriously and not taking it like something to worship, something to actually work with and repurpose. So I like those. I like all of that cinema.
Okay.
Yeah.
You were talking before about how these films became really popular in Russia in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that, Hindi filmmakers are really trying very hard to get their films known and, to become big here in Britain. What do you think are the barriers for that success?
What do I think the barriers to success are? I think one of the big barriers to success for Indian films in the 90s was that they were trying too hard to be Western. So they were trying a little too hard to be like savvy, Western, hip, sort of consumption-oriented, globalized shopping mall subjects. That's basically the candy floss that was churned out by the Yash Chopras and whatnots in the 1990s. And I think the best way to success for Hindi cinema is for it to really find its own aesthetic style. I mean, it's difficult to say anymore that there is something like Hindi cinema. You could say that up until the 90s, but since about 1996, 97, all the major Hollywood production houses are making Hindi films. So 20th Century Fox makes Hindi films. Columbia, Sony, all of these film production houses, Universal, they all have invested in production houses in Bombay. And so the distinction between West and the Western films and Indian films have really broken down at the level of production, at the level of actual the creative moment even. In terms of it catching on, I mean, I think these things are kind of a chance thing in some ways. I mean, like, who could have foretold that Salman Khan, who by every indication his career was washed up, would make the two of the biggest blockbusters in the history of recent cinema, called Dabangg 1 and 2. And again, schlock films, but they became massive hits because Salman Khan was making fun of himself. He was sort of, you know, ironic. He was ironic with his own sort of persona. That's not something the Western audiences are going to get, because, you know, I mean, the people who get them is the people who watched Salman Khan go from, you know, a gangly youth to a complete dork, to a complete sort of egotistical bodybuilder taking steroids, to a person who's now making quasi-comedy films about his own history. You have to actually, so I mean, in that sense, it requires a kind of audience that has been paying attention. So those films I don't think will ever have a kind of purchase on Western audiences. The kind of films that Western audiences I think are going to resonate with are these more Hatke cinemas, the more Hatke films, the films that are sort of made for audiences that are not dominant mainstream audiences, or and willing to sort of think about experimenting with and experiencing experiments in aesthetic form as film. I mean, I haven't looked at the most recent box office revenue collections in the West and in India, but in my reckoning, it's going to be a kind of expression that breaks with both the masala cinema and the idea that you can only speak to the West in their own idioms, in their own language. It's going to be some sort of break from both those two binds, those two dead ends, that I think a new, probably, business model is going to emerge in Hindi cinema.
Okay. You were saying that these Hollywood production houses are investing a lot in...
Not a lot, but yeah, they are investing.
Do you think this is changing the films, the industry? Is it becoming more westernized?
What is changing? It's not at the level of narrative. It's not even at the level of images or aesthetics. It's the level of organization and the level of work culture that's changed in Hindi cinema. So everyone speaks today in the industry about how things become much more professionalized. That the sort of old boy structure, the old boy network is, if not broken down, at least breaking down. And part of that has been an effect of Hindi Urdu cinema going globalized. So the globalization of Hindi Urdu cinema has meant that business models that are standard across the world have entered the organizational and workspace of the industry. Do I think that's going to have effects at or impact at the level of narrative and content and story? Obviously it does, but it's not. You can't easily just read it off like that. You can't just say, you know, this film was made by 20th Century Fox, so it's going to have this or that. You know, I think that process is much more complicated and determined by many different things. But definitely, what you can say without any shadow of a doubt is that the work culture has changed, and that's been a huge change, both for the industry but also for India in general.
Yeah. You're saying that well, you work a lot with marketing and stuff like that. If Bollywood is trying to be, or Hindi cinema is trying to be really successful in Britain and America and these, you know, foreign markets, why don't they, you know, market their films more in English? Maybe sort of change the name in English so people remember more. Do you think that would have an effect, or, I mean, why is there not so much marketing for these films?
Well, I think that's a good question. Why? What has been the downfall, or what has been the pitfalls of marketing these films? I think, you know, if you look at how Hindi cinema is marketed in India, a lot of it is rooted in sort of melodramatic aesthetic forms. So even when contemporary, you know, Hatke cinema is marketed, it's generally presented as a series of problems in the life of a person that is resolved in the cinema. that's a bit of a generalization, but I think it's generally true. I don't think that sort of presentation would work in terms of marketing. I think a lot of the marketing in the West has relied on word of mouth. Like I remember, what was it? Not Dal. It was what was that Amir Khan film? The famous film about taxes.